Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've heard some very dramatic rhetoric today about what this bill does and what it doesn't do. And it matches some of the rhetoric that we've seen over the last week that has tried to use House Bill 1603 as a bill to define one scope of practice. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 1603 is not a scope of practice change. It is not the forum to have a scope of practice debate. We've heard that this bill is a full step backwards. Mr. Speaker, it takes a long-standing regulation and it codifies it into law. I do not know how maintaining the status quo is a full step backwards. As many of us know, the administering of anesthesia is a very serious, complicated, and life-threatening procedure. And when done in an operating room of a hospital, surgical healthcare teams made up of doctors and nurses are typically addressing some of the most serious and critical problems a patient can experience. And when dealing with these serious cases, the risk of complications and potentially life-threatening complications are most likely to arise and difficult to overcome. And they typically have the smallest window of time to address these concerns. These difficult times, life-threatening complications, take the most talented and the most experienced personnel to work together to achieve success and to protect a patient's life. The current teamwork system in place now allows a physician, an anesthesiologist, and a nurse anesthetist to strike a reasonable balance between maximizing patient safety and maximizing resources. We've heard how the teamwork system in place has been so successful. But we've also heard that maintaining that successful relationship in House Bill 1603, protecting that if changes are going to occur, we've heard how all of a sudden that's a huge step backwards. So if we're just protecting the current system, why is this bill necessary? I think that is an absolute and fair and appropriate question. Simply put, it is needed to protect patient safety as the key ingredient in the future scope of practice debates. We're not having that scope of practice debate here today, but clearly interest groups that oppose this bill, members that oppose this bill, would love to have a scope of practice debate. We've heard objections to this bill because a scope of practice debate is needed to expand a nurse's scope of practice while restricting a physician's scope of practice. House Bill 1603 does not do that. While a scope of practice change may be honorable, commendable, maybe even appropriate, I believe that the Professional Licensure Committee should vet that process. I believe that the legislature, the People's Chamber, and the Senate should debate those scope of practice changes. I believe that the Medical Practice Act, which guides the actions of physicians, which is what we're talking about in House Bill 1603, is the law which these debates should originate. I believe that the legislative branch, specifically the Professional Licensure Committee, should define the boundaries of where one scope of practice begins and where another ends. A backdoor approach through the regulatory process or amending an act that doesn't guide the actions of a physician is not the appropriate place to have a scope of practice debate. Those debates will not guarantee that patient safety is the most important part of that debate. This legislation takes a very appropriate regulation, one that is working extremely well, and simply puts it into law, making certain that any deviation from that scope of practice will be done in the light of day and ensures patient safety. I think that is more than appropriate. And the concept of not having hearings on this piece of legislation, as we've heard from my colleague from Allegheny County, is not accurate. And I think when this chamber debates going forward from taking a bill that would take a long-standing regulation and simply codify that into law, I think if every chairman in this chamber had to hold a hearing on those types of bill every single time, I think they would get frustrated with that process. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge that we send this bill to the Senate and we protect patient safety and the role of a physician and a role of a nurse, and we put it into law. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.